So, a question I get asked all the time from people is when the fearful avoidant realizes that they lost you, what happens? How do they feel? And how do they process this? So obviously, this sort of begs the question, how does a fearful avoidant attachment style deal with a breakup, first and foremost? And I think one of the first things that you really want to recognize is that fearful avoidants have both an anxious side and an avoidant side. And this anxious or avoidant side that they are operating in more often is going to be largely determined by their external factors and how that triggers their internal core wounds. So, for example, a fearful avoidant could really like somebody and be super interested in them, but if that person is trying to become codependent or too enmeshed or move too quickly, the core wounds or fears of an anxious preoccupied of being trapped or helpless or powerless in the wrong situation or stuck there or being betrayed by the wrong person, these are the things on their more avoidant side of their wounding that are going to be triggered. So even if somebody seems great for the fearful avoidant, they're really interested in them, they're going to end up moving more into their avoidant side because of those different triggers that are coming up. On the flip side of that, if a fearful avoidant is with somebody who's more dismissive to them than they are to other people when they're in their dismissive avoidant side, then instead it's going to polarize the fearful avoidant to become more anxious. And in that case, what you're going to see is that those abandonment core wounds, the fear of being alone, being rejected, not good enough, these sorts of wounds are going to come up and dictate their behaviors. Now, obviously, in a perfect world, we'd love for a fearful avoidant, and if you are the fearful avoidant listening, to do the reprogramming on those wounds because it's a painful thing to go through and to go back and forth between those sides all the time is exhausting for you more than anybody, but also it can be tough on loved ones because there ends up being this element of intermittent reinforcement, which is actually part of what gamblers get addicted to. That intermittency of the reward, right? Like for fearful avoidance, sometimes you're loving and you're warm and at your best, and other times you can really pull away suddenly out of the blue, and it can cause that person to be like, oh my gosh, where did that go? And to sort of chase after that individual. So because of this intermittent reinforcement, we can see different dynamics here. But what you want to recognize, and why I'm explaining the anxious and avoidant side, is that when a fearful avoidant first goes through a breakup, more often than not, they go into their avoidance side. And they tend to try to convince themselves as sort of a self-soothing technique that like it wasn't the right relationship, they don't need that person any longer, it wasn't going to work anyways, and they'll go into their avoidance side and they will actually have those wounds come up. And when somebody's in their more avoidant side, they tend to comfort and soothe through creature comforts more frequently. In this case in particular, you'll see a fearful avoidant usually end up like numbing out, maybe drinking, maybe partying more often, maybe smoking, like whatever it is, something to just basically distract themselves from what they're feeling while convincing themselves that like life is much better now that they're free. However, for fearful avoidance in particular, there tends to be a 3 to 6 week period of extreme deactivation where they kind of numb out their feelings and try to convince themselves they don't really feel anything at all. And then if there's no contact, so if there is like no communication with the ex during that time, the ex isn't reaching out, there's nothing to polarize them or sort of force them into that more avoidant side. So what happens just as a byproduct is there's sort of this boomerang effect where after that 3 to 6 week period ends, then the fearful avoidant might go more into their anxious side, which I see happen the vast majority of the time. And in that anxious side, those core wounds will be triggered where they may actually experience regret, curiosity, wondering if somebody might want to get back together with them, if they made a mistake, wondering what that person's doing that's their ex. Even like self-blame can be a big theme at that point. However, the fearful avoidant still may not want to reach out. So after that 3 to 6 week sort of deactivation piece, often I see fearful avoidance move into a 6 week to about 3 months or 4 months activation side, particularly if there's no contact. Again, that will be broken generally, and they'll go back to deactivating if the ex reaches out like before that 6 week mark. And so it's in that space that a fearful avoidant may be most interested in getting back together. Now, I want to say a few quick things here, and we're going to go through like how to tell. We're going to talk about what you need to know, both as a fearful avoidant or ex of a fearful avoidant if you're considering getting back together. I will say that one of the first and most important things is not to just jump back into a relationship for the sake of it. If you're going to consider getting back together with somebody, it should be that you understand new things that you didn't before. You're willing to have different types of conversations or with more open communication, with better boundaries. Like there's so many important things here to discuss, because I personally wouldn't advocate for anybody to just be in a painful situation, break up, get back together without changing things, because you're just more likely to get to a painful breakup again. But I also very much understand there's a lot of people out here who are like watching these videos every day, doing reprogramming work, all these sorts of things. I do have, if you want to do a deeper dive, and I'll still explain some stuff in just a moment, but I do have a course. It's all about reconnecting with an FA. We actually have these for all the different attachment styles and like what's important, how to tell if it's the right, choice to reconnect with somebody, what to look for, what to do differently, how the reconnection should go. And I'll put the link to that course down below. And it is free for 14 days. So more than enough time to get through that entire reconnection roadmap with a fearful avoidant. And it also gives you access to everything at PDS for the next 14 days as well for free. And so moving back to this idea is, once you have these conversations about, is it going to work? Can we do this? Like, is this the right relationship to be in? Once those things are really, discussed, essentially the best time to discuss them is not right after you get back in contact. So you first want to wait that 6 weeks essentially of no contact after the breakup to do the work for yourself, right? To really dig in and be like, who am I? What do I want? What wasn't working? Is it workable the next time around? But really digging into like reprogramming your core wounds, your fears, meeting your own needs, learning to be in this relationship to yourself again. And if you feel like you really grew during that time and could see a different approach and a different path of doing things, that's when it becomes a really good time to have a different discussion. And at that point in particular, there's generally this like 8-week phase once you start speaking with a fearful avoidant ex again, where they still, we sort of joke about this sometimes with all the respect to fearful avoidance, but fearful avoidants want to like act like they're in a relationship without being in a relationship during the reconnection phase. They want to, hang out, be there, but not have these like commitment oriented discussions, because going back to what we talked about at the very start of this video, those commitment oriented discussions will just polarize them back into their avoidant side again. So there needs to be this kind of building of momentum, this open conversation, set of dialogues around things. And in that 8 weeks of reconnecting, after that 6 weeks of no contact, that tends to be where it's really important to have those discussions. What can we do differently? How are we not communicating properly the first time? What boundaries do we need? What changes would we need to make if we were going to try this again? And having those discussions allows you to actually have a healthy future ahead of you in the relationship dynamic. If there's no reconnection that ever happens, and the fearful avoidant just realizes they lost you as a whole, there will be this kind of often regret period a fearful avoidant has. But keep in mind, fearful avoidants still don't want to be vulnerable. So they may not externalize that. They may not express that to you or let you know. And what I'll generally see is there's like the 6 weeks first of no contact, 6 weeks, fearful avoidant convinces themselves all is good. They're in a better space now. They have their freedom. Then they reactivate. Then they have about 6 weeks to about 3 to 4 months of kind of missing their ex and wondering what if. And whether they reach out or not during that time depends on many different factors. But after that 4 month mark, post 6 weeks, so we're looking at like 3 to 4 months after that first initial 6 weeks. So you're looking at, in total, around 5 or so months after the relationship ends. At that point, fearful avoidants tend to make a turnaround and, heal and work through things and, move on to different relationship dynamics or discussions or friendships or different ways of essentially getting their needs met and sort of have more closure. But I do find that that's sort of the span of time it more often than not takes. So hopefully this was helpful for you. Again, if you want to go through that reconnection course for free for 14 days, I put the link down below. I know so many people ask questions about it. So I was like, I'm just going to make a course out of it. So you can always check that out. And I hope you enjoy this channel. If you are enjoying and want to hit the like button or subscribe, I would always super appreciate that. And thank you so much for stopping by, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in future videos.